Hey guys, tonight we are going to unveil the tragedy of Queen Catherine Howard and her powerful husband, King Henry VIII, a fleeting love story that ended with an axe and a mystery spanning 4 centuries. At just 19 years old, Catherine was executed for treason. The question is not how she died, but why she had to die when she was merely a young girl caught up in the Game of Thrones. And what happened next? What makes this story haunting is her final resting place. Catherine was buried inside the Tower of London, but 300 years later, when archaeologists excavated her grave, they uncovered a terrifying truth. Her body had completely vanished. Not a single bone, not a single trace. Did she turn to dust? Or did her spirit decide not to leave any evidence of the cruelty she endured? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are watching from and what the local time is where you are. Tonight, we will explore together why this young queen refused to rest in peace. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. February 13th, 1542, arrived with a chill in the air and a hush that seemed to ripple through every stone of the Tower of London. On that fateful morning, Catherine Howard, barely 19 years old, and the 5th wife of King Henry VIII, was led from her chamber to the scaffold, her footsteps echoing softly against ancient walls. As cousin to Anne Boleyn, who had met her own tragic end within the same fortress 6 years earlier, Catherine's fate seemed inescapably woven into the tapestry of Tudor sorrow. In silence, she knelt upon the wooden block, the coarse fabric of her gown rustling like faded memories beneath her. Then, at a single measured stroke, the executioner's axe fell, and Catherine's short, bright life was extinguished. Her body, clad in humble burial shrouds, was promised a final resting place in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a mere few paces from where Anne Boleyn herself lay interred. This unassuming sanctuary within the tower walls had become the unofficial cemetery for traitors and royals alike. Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, and other once powerful figures had all found their graves in its soil. In the hush of that chapel, Catherine's remains should have joined these solemn ranks, each grave a testament to history's unrelenting churn of fortune and downfall. Yet for more than 3 centuries, a mystery lingered beneath the chapel floorboards. In 1876, during a curious restoration undertaken by the Victorians, archaeologists and workmen lifted the cold, worn stone slabs to examine the graves below. They uncovered Anne Boleyn's skeleton, still more complete than expected, despite centuries of burial rituals. Nearby, they identified the fragmented remains of Jane Boleyn and others whose ages and statures matched historical records. But when they reached the spot marked for Catherine Howard, her supposed grave just to the right of the altar, not a single bone greeted their shovels. No shattered tooth, no fragment of skull, not even residual dust where her body ought to have lain. This absence of Catherine's remains spun a web of questions that no Victorian account could fully unravel. Had her youthful bones somehow dissolved into nothingness? Did the lime used in Tudor interments, once believed to hasten decay, consume her entirely? Modern forensic science tells us that lime actually tends to preserve human remains, turning soft tissues to a hardened shell and leaving bones intact for centuries. Yet in the absence of Catherine's skeleton, the old theory persisted in whispered corridors. Perhaps her bones were far more delicate at 19, more prone to disintegration. But if this were so, how did the bones of older or less fragile individuals survive in the very same soil? Some speculated that grave robbers of earlier centuries, sordid figures who prized the bones of the famous as macabre souvenirs, might have purloined Catherine's remains. Body snatchers were hardly strangers to London's underworld, but the wholesale removal of an entire skeleton would have required planning and secrecy on a grand scale. Another possibility whispered through historical circles was that Catherine's grave had been mislocated, perhaps disturbed and reburied elsewhere in the tower complex during later renovations. Yet contemporary records insist she was buried within the chapel walls, under the feet of pilgrims and guards, awaiting her rediscovery. Beyond these physical theories, a deeper question beckons. Did Catherine Howard truly deserve the grim verdict rendered against her? In the final months of 1541, the young queen had been accused of adultery and concealment of past liaisons, charges that, while technically applicable, obscured the more poignant truth of her upbringing. Groomed in the permissive household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, she had been preyed upon in adolescence by older men who flattered and coerced her. These youthful entanglements, dug up and thrust into the harsh glare of Tudor justice, became her undoing, a cruel weapon in the hands of courtiers eager to avenge their own ambitions, and a king determined never to appear a fool. Thus, as Catherine's missing remains continue to elude discovery, they also embody the absence of her own voice, a 17-year-old girl who was never fully heard, whose pleas and explanations were drowned beneath the roar of royal wrath. In life, she had been a pawn in power games far larger than herself. In death, she remains an enigma, a blank space on the map of Tudor history, even as tourists wander the chapel, pausing to glimpse the memorial plaques that mark the graves of centuries-gone nobility. No stone bears her name where her bones lie, if indeed they lie here at all. And so the tower keeps its secret, tucked away beneath cold flagstones and the soft footsteps of visitors. The story of Catherine Howard's disappearance transcends the mere loss of bones. It speaks to the fragility of youth, the brutality of absolute power, and the ways in which history can erase those it deems inconvenient. Even now, more than 400 years later, Catherine's silent absence invites us to question, in a world written by the powerful, who is allowed to rest and who is destined to remain forever unburied? On a cold autumn morning in 1541, a sudden knock echoed through the corridors of Hampton Court Palace and forever altered the destiny of 19-year-old Catherine Howard. Clad in sumptuous silk and glittering jewels, garments that had once symbolized her status as the beloved queen, she opened the door to find a contingent of royal soldiers waiting. Their faces were stern, their orders unambiguous. By command of His Majesty the King, you are to come with us immediately. In that instant, Catherine ceased to be the cherished fifth wife of King Henry VIII and became a prisoner of the crown. News of her arrest spread like wildfire through the Tudor court. Courtiers whispered in hushed tones along tapestry-lined hallways, their voices carrying rumors that the young queen faced charges of adultery, precisely the same accusation that had condemned her cousin Anne Boleyn to the executioner's block 6 years earlier. The revelation sent shockwaves through the nobility. How could the vibrant, youthful queen, whose laughter had once filled the halls of Hampton Court, now be branded a traitor in the eyes of the most powerful man in England? Henry VIII, who only months before had lavished Catherine with love letters and precious gifts, now seethed with rage at what he perceived as betrayal. When the news reached his chambers, the king's anger was swift and merciless. Catherine, trembling and distraught, fell to her knees before him, tears streaking down her pale cheeks as she pleaded for a chance to explain herself. She begged him to hear her side of the story, to grant her audience in private, to permit her to clear her name. But the king, his pride wounded and his fury unrestrained, refused every entreaty. His decision was final. Catherine Howard was to be stripped of her titles and banished from the king's presence. That very night, Catherine was escorted under heavy guard to Sion Abbey, a grim and imposing convent repurposed as a place of confinement. The abbey's stone walls, cloaked in creeping ivy, loomed coldly overhead. Its long, narrow corridors resounded with the clack of the soldiers' boots and the echo of locked doors. Here, within these unforgiving quarters, Catherine would spend the next months in isolation. Visitors were forbidden. Her letters were intercepted and censored by royal clerks. She was watched day and night by vigilant guards who took no pity on her youth or her tears. No candlelight danced in her chamber windows. No songbirds sang outside her barred lattice. Only the relentless chill of prison life and the constant burden of uncertainty remained. In the hush of Sion Abbey's cloistered gloom, Catherine's mind must have wandered back to the events that led her here. Was she truly guilty of the crime of adultery? Or had she been ensnared by machinations far more sinister? To understand why the king had turned so swiftly against her, one must look beyond the charge itself and consider the deeper forces at play. Catherine's downfall did not begin on this autumn morning. It had taken root long before she ever set foot in a royal bedchamber. Her youthful indiscretions, relationships with older men at the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household when she was barely 13, secret liaisons with Francis Derham and whispered promises of marriage had been carefully recorded, hushed up at the time but now resurrected as damning evidence. The same advisors and courtiers who had once praised her beauty and wit had gathered letters and testimonies, ready to present them when the moment suited their own agendas. In the ruthless world of Tudor politics, personal affection meant little when contrasted with the preservation of power and reputation. Henry's wounded pride demanded retribution for having been deceived. The slightest hint of impropriety was enough to justify the most severe punishment. As Catherine sat alone in her cold cell at Sion Abbey, she must have wondered whether any plea could sway a king determined to restore his honour. The charges against her concealing past indiscretions from her sovereign, entertaining private meetings with Thomas Culpeper after her marriage, though technically precise, failed to capture the true nature of her supposed betrayal. The real crime, in Henry's eyes, was not adultery itself but deception. A young queen, elevated to the highest station, had hidden her earlier transgressions and, in doing so, had made a mockery of his judgment. Yet in the stillness of confinement, one might imagine Catherine's thoughts drifting toward mercy and forgiveness. She may have recalled moments of genuine affection, the brief flashes of tenderness Henry had shown her, the rare times when she believed herself secure in his favour. Perhaps she rehearsed the words she would say if granted a final audience. Words of apology, of loyalty, of heartfelt regret. But the gates remained closed, the guards unyielding, and the only response was the silent clang of iron locks. By the time Catherine's fate was sealed, it was clear that her arrest had less to do with actual adultery than with the unforgiving demands of royal dignity. Henry VIII could pardon infidelity if it served his interests, but he could never suffer the humiliation of being deceived. In punishing Catherine, he sent a stark warning to any who might challenge his authority. Even a queen must pay dearly for betraying the king's trust. And so, within the sombre walls of Sion Abbey, Catherine Howard's life hung in the balance. Accused of a crime that carried the same stigma as her cousin's, she awaited judgment not merely on the basis of her actions, but as a symbol of loyalty and submission to a monarch whose wrath brooked no compromise. In the chill silence of her prison cell, the question remained: was Catherine Howard truly guilty of the betrayal attributed to her, or was she simply the latest casualty of a court where power eclipsed compassion and where a knock on the door could change everything? To understand Catherine Howard's tragedy, one must return to her earliest years, long before she donned a crown or crossed the threshold of the royal court. Born circa 1521 into the illustrious Howard family, Catherine entered the world bearing a noble lineage, yet lacking the comfort her bloodline might suggest. Her father, Edmund Howard, was the youngest son of a powerful duke, his rank high in name, but his purse and political clout painfully modest. Catherine's mother died when she was still a child, leaving a void of maternal guidance at an age when such steadiness is most needed. Shortly thereafter, Catherine was placed in the care of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. While the title evoked images of grand halls and ceremonial splendour, the reality of life under the Duchess's roof was far less comforting. Dozens of young girls, wards of the Duchess, nieces, distant cousins, were quartered together in long dormitory chambers. Thick drapes hung from the ceiling to create crude partitions, but the scant supervision meant that rules were rarely more than whispered suggestions. Discipline was weak, punishments for misbehaviour were unevenly applied, and the atmosphere rippled with an unsettling sense of permissiveness. Men moved freely through the household. Secretaries brought correspondence, tutors came to instruct, and various visitors passed through for banquets or political consultation. In such an environment, boundaries grew porous. For a girl of Catherine's vivacity and beauty, brisk of step and bright of eye, the attention was immediate. She laughed easily, spoke with a cheerful lilt, and carried herself with a natural grace that seemed to brighten even the dimmest corner of the dormitories. Yet her youth and innocence rendered her vulnerable, a fact not lost on those who saw opportunity in her naivete. At approximately 13 years old, Catherine caught the eye of her music master, Henry Manox. An older man with cultivated manners, Manox offered flattering praise and small tokens of affection. A ribbon here, a book of psalms there, until his kindness eased the girl's caution. His initial attentions seemed benign, even kindly, but his hands soon strayed beyond the bounds of propriety, caressing where a teacher ought not to caress, whispering promises the girl was too inexperienced to question. In the hush of candle-lit practice rooms, Catherine's innocence slipped away in soft chords and furtive glances. Not long after, another figure entered her life, Francis Derham, a man of slightly higher station and dashing demeanour. He spoke of marriage in secret, planting in the girl's heart a sense of belonging and protection she had never truly known. Under the pretense of courtly romance, Derham claimed rights over her, insisting that a whispered vow equaled a binding contract. Though Catherine felt a warmth in his attentions, she also felt the weight of obligation. To refuse him seemed unthinkable. In that heady season, the distinction between genuine affection and coercion blurred, leaving Catherine ensnared in promises she neither fully understood nor could fully reject. In the broad daylight of palace life, such youthful indiscretions might have remained private peccadilloes, excusable errors of inexperience. Yet Catherine's world was not the sheltered realm of ordinary children. It was a crucible of power and reputation. The seeds of her later downfall were sown in these corridors of the Dowager Duchess's household, where rules were scant and oversight minimal. The same walls that echoed with the laughter of girls at play also witnessed whispered rendezvous and broken confidences. As Catherine grew into her 17th year, her beauty and vivacity caught the attention of higher-placed patrons. But the spectre of her past lingered invisibly at her back. The letters she had exchanged with Manox, the secret pledges made to Derham, each scrap of memory became latent material, waiting to be dredged up. When Catherine was later thrust into the glare of the Tudor court, these youthful liaisons would be excavated and warped into damning evidence. In a realm where a queen's virtue was as much political currency as her lineage, even the faintest hint of impropriety spelled peril. Yet in those quiet days at Sion, before her elevation as queen and long before her arrest, Catherine's childhood experiences shaped the contours of her character. She learned to crave affection, to equate attention with safety, and to obscure her own uncertainties behind a gleaming smile. The lack of consistent guidance left her unprepared for the treacherous intrigues of court, but it also endowed her with a resilience born of necessity. In the hush of her later confinement, she would recall the lonely nights in the dormitories, the flicker of candlelight in draught-swept halls, and the confusion of a child caught between genuine care and hidden agendas. Thus, Catherine Howard's early years were neither pastoral idyll nor seamless privilege. They were a lesson in vulnerability amidst opulence, an education in the subtle wielding of power, as much as a grounding in family pride. The golden age of the Tudors was never meant for the innocent. It demanded subtlety, cunning, and an unflinching appraisal of one's own past. In that austere household under the watchful eye of the Dowager Duchess, Catherine learned both the fragility of trust and the perilous allure of promises. These twin lessons, etched into her memory, would accompany her to the very steps of the scaffold and to a rest that may still lie hidden beneath the stones of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. When Catherine Howard was barely 13 years old, circa 1534, she found herself under the attentive tutelage of Henry Manox, the household's music master. Manox was a man of some standing, older than the girl by perhaps a decade, and he carried himself with the refined air of a court servant, accustomed to the trappings of nobility. To Catherine's youthful eyes, he seemed both kind and distinguished, offering praise for her natural musical talent and selecting the sweetest melodies for her to learn. Yet his kindness carried a weight that the timid girl could not fully comprehend. Manox presented Catherine with small tokens, a ribbon of pale blue silk, a gilded comb, sometimes a pressed flower tucked into the pages of her music book. His words were softer than the hush of candlelight in the practice chamber. "You have a gift," he would murmur, a voice as gentle as dawn. In those moments, Catherine felt herself blooming under his attention, as though each note she played were a petal unfolding. She was too young to sense the danger in his gentleness, too inexperienced to grasp the boundaries their relationship should never have crossed. In the privacy of those dimly lit rooms, Manox's hand sometimes lingered on her shoulder, brushing her hair back with a touch that grew increasingly intimate. Catherine, innocently hopeful, neither moved away nor protested. She lacked the understanding to see that such contact lay beyond the innocence of a teacher's care. She felt flattered and protected, believing herself chosen and special. The warmth of his presence became a source of comfort, an anchor in the uncertain world of the Dowager Duchess's bustling household. Before long, another figure entered Catherine's life and further eroded her fragile sense of safety. Francis Derham. He was a handsome young man of the household, perhaps in his early 20s, whose confidence and charm offered Catherine a different kind of promise. Where Manox had provided flattery, cloaked in the guise of mentorship, Derham offered the illusion of partnership. He spoke to her of vows and devotion, whispering that in the secrecy of their meetings they were husband and wife, bound by a sacred contract of the heart. Catherine, longing for affection and stability, things she had missed after her mother's death, found herself drawn to Derham's assurances. In his company she felt a sensation she had never known: belonging. He treated her as an equal, inviting her to walk with him in the gardens, to share confidences under the shelter of the yew trees. Yet beneath the veneer of romance lay an unspoken demand. He expected her obedience and loyalty, as though his promises conferred upon him a right to her body. In the permissive atmosphere of the Dowager Duchess's domain, the line between genuine care and coercion blurred until it was almost invisible. Rules were lax, discipline rare, and the voices of those who might have intervened were drowned in the clamour of household affairs. Catherine's days and nights melded into a cycle of whispered rendezvous and stolen letters. Her innocence slipped away in the hush of moonlit corridors, exchanged for the illusion of love and the illusion of protection. These youthful indiscretions, flirtations with a tutor, secret pledges to a suitor seemed to Catherine like fleeting episodes of warmth in an otherwise chilly existence. Yet their consequences would stretch far beyond those quiet years. For when she was later elevated to the heights of the Tudor court, every tender word and clandestine embrace would be seized upon as evidence of unworthiness. Historians would later describe her liaisons as proof of moral frailty, repurposing those private moments into political ammunition. But in that moment of innocence, Catherine could not foresee the storm gathering on the horizon. She did not know that her beauty and youth would propel her to the centre of royal ambition, making her the focus of courtly admiration and courtly envy. Nor could she predict that the very qualities that endeared her to Manox and Derham, her lively spirit, her open heart, would later be held against her as evidence of a reckless temperament. Yet fate, as it often does, had other plans. From the unremarkable dormitories of Norfolk House, Catherine was plucked into the dazzling world of the royal court. There, she encountered the formidable presence of King Henry VIII himself, then approaching 50 years of age, his body heavy and his reputation marked by triumphs and tragedies alike. To Henry, Catherine's youth was intoxicating. To Catherine, Henry's power was a heady new reality. In leaving behind the sheltered but precarious haven of her step-grandmother's home, Catherine carried with her the lessons learned in those early liaisons, the longing for affection, the willingness to believe in promises, the vulnerability to flattery. All of these would guide her steps into the glittering court, where she would capture the gaze of the most dangerous man in England. But even as Catherine's beauty shone more brilliantly than ever before, the faint echoes of her youthful attachments would follow her, shaping her destiny in ways she could never have imagined. When Catherine Howard first stepped into the royal presence, King Henry VIII was a man transformed by time and burdened by years of both triumph and tragedy. No longer the handsome young prince who had once captured the admiration of Europe, he now carried a body heavy with age and illness. His once lithe frame had grown stout. His gait was impaired by the chronic pain of an ulcerated leg that refused to heal, a relentless reminder of his mortality. Yet it was not merely the ravages of disease and time that marked him, it was, above all, the deep scars etched upon his pride. Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, solemnized in January of 1540, had been arranged by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, as part of a political strategy to secure an alliance with the powerful German states. The union was meant to reinforce England's standing on the continent, yet from the very first meeting at Rochester, the king recoiled. Accounts of that day describe Anne's appearance as failing to match the carefully chosen portrait sent to Henry. The language of courtly flattery gave way to cruel mockery. He is said to have greeted her with the words, "I like her not," likening her to a Flanders mare, and lamenting the deception he felt he had suffered. For Henry, the sense of being tricked was not a mere personal slight, but a public humiliation that cut deeply into his royal dignity. He had been sought after by noble houses across Europe, the Valois of France, the Habsburgs of Spain, and the Dukes of Burgundy, each vying for his favour in marriage alliances. Now, he found himself bound to a spouse he neither desired nor respected, her presence reminding him at every turn of the fiasco. The very thought that his own minister had misled him to secure a political match struck at the core of his authority. It was more than disappointment. It was shame laid bare before the entire court and all of Christendom. The courtiers, ever attuned to their sovereign's moods, soon followed his lead. Behind closed doors and in hushed whispers among candlelit galleries, they laughed at Henry's misfortune. Their whispers wound through the corridors. "The king has been deceived," they murmured, "and we are left to bear witness." The stifled giggles of noblemen dancing in the shadows struck him as betrayal not just of his person, but of the monarchy itself. Each stifled laugh felt like a dagger, deepening the wound to his pride. With characteristic decisiveness, Henry cast aside Anne of Cleves in July of 1540, annulling the marriage on the grounds of non-consummation and false pretenses. The annulment proceedings moved swiftly, as though time itself conspired to erase the memory of the union. Anne was granted the title the King's Sister, and provided with a generous settlement of lands and income, yet her removal from the role of queen carried a bitter public sting. The palace gates rang with the clatter of hushed gossip. The great Christian monarch, once the symbol of strength and stability, had been bested by his own vanity. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Cleves match and the king's trusted advisor, paid the ultimate price. In July of 1540, Cromwell was arrested and accused of treason and heresy. A mere 6 days after the annulment, he was beheaded on Tower Hill, a grim testament to the king's wounded pride. Where once Cromwell had orchestrated Henry's marital alliances with skill and ambition, he now stood as an example of the perils of misjudging his sovereign's wounded ego. The speed of his downfall was as swift and irreversible as any stroke of the executioner's sword. It was in the aftermath of this humiliation that Henry found himself yearning for redemption. His heart, still restless and unfulfilled, sought solace in the promise of youth. Catherine Howard, with her vibrant presence and unguarded charm, offered the possibility of renewal. To the king she embodied forgiveness and reinvention. To Catherine he appeared as both protector and conqueror. In courting her, Henry was not simply pursuing a fresh start. He was asserting his undiminished power, reclaiming the authority that he felt had temporarily slipped through his fingers. Yet even as Catherine's image glowed in his eyes, the shadow of the Cleves catastrophe lingered. Henry approached their meetings with a caution born of past betrayal, yet also with a desperation for affirmation. He lavished her with jewels, necklaces of gold, rings set with precious stones, a string of pearls said to be worth more than £500, and with flattery that ignited her youthful confidence. For Catherine, these tokens were more than mere gifts. They represented the fulfillment of her deepest longings for affection and security. In those moments, the echoes of Anne of Cleves faded, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. But Henry's pride, though momentarily soothed, remained fragile. He had learned that alliances could crumble on a single misjudgment, that even the grandest plans could disintegrate in an instant of perceived deceit. His heart may have found a measure of joy in Catherine's laughter, but his mind was ever watchful for signs of duplicity. The King of England, once enamoured by power and prestige, now navigated his affections with the wary tread of a man who had known both triumph and disgrace. Thus, when Catherine entered his life, Henry was not the carefree youth he once had been, but a monarch shaped by vulnerability, a man whose wounded pride could instigate swift and merciless justice. For beneath the pageantry of courtship lay the unspoken understanding that any hint of deception, any betrayal real or imagined, would be met with the same inexorable force that had torn down Anne of Cleves and Thomas Cromwell. And so, as Catherine's fate drew ever closer to the throne, the memory of that autumn humiliation remained etched into the very fabric of Henry's resolve, ensuring that his next marital chapter, however bright it seemed, would be written with both hope and trepidation. When Catherine Howard appeared at court in the summer of 1540, she brought with her the radiance of youth and an unguarded sweetness that contrasted sharply with the sombre countenance of her predecessor. Anne of Cleves, once chosen to secure a powerful alliance with the German states, had struck Henry VIII as plain and distant, provoking neither passion nor admiration. But Catherine, at 19 years of age, possessed all that Anne lacked: the soft glow of unblemished beauty, a warm attentiveness in her manner, and a gentle charm that spoke of genuine affection rather than duty. On that first day Catherine entered the royal presence, King Henry was struck not merely by her looks but by the renewal she seemed to promise. He leaned forward on his cushioned throne, his heavy frame racked with pain from an ulcerated leg that had festered for years. Yet in Catherine's presence he felt a stirring of forgotten delight. For a man who had been mocked behind his back, who had endured the humiliation of a disastrous marriage and the betrayal of his own dignity, Catherine's gaze felt like a balm. She did not recoil or flinch at his appearance. Instead, she met his eyes with open curiosity and a gentle deference that made him feel respected rather than ridiculed. To Henry, Catherine was more than a bride. She was redemption. She embodied everything Anne had failed to. Anne had been chosen by ministers, displayed in public ceremonies, and then quickly discarded when she did not satisfy the king's expectations. Catherine, in contrast, seemed to appear as if by divine providence, her arrival unannounced by council, but heralded by the vibrant smile she cast upon Henry. In her he found proof that he was still powerful, still desirable, still a man to be feared and revered. Her youthful presence masked the deep wounds to his pride, and for the first time since his repudiation of Anne, Henry felt himself fully king again. Historians note that Henry courted Catherine with the intensity of a young suitor. He penned her letters written in careful, florid script, addressing her with tender epithets and pledging both his protection and his heart. He showered her with lavish gifts, a necklace of gold set with rubies, each stone said to weigh half a carat, a ring bearing a heart, shaped emerald, rumoured to have cost no less than £500, and silken gowns in hues of rose and pearl white. These tokens were not merely symbols of affection, but declarations of royal intent. Catherine was to occupy a place of honour unmatched by any previous consort. Yet Henry's elevation of Catherine to the role of queen was not without its dangers. In placing her on a pedestal, he unwittingly set her upon a stage strewn with political landmines. At nearly 50 years of age, he was heavy, diseased, and in relentless pain. He required constant care. Physicians attended his every complaint, and his attendants carried poultices and bandages for his festering ulcer. His desperation for a new source of happiness, fresh, untainted, and obedient, left him vulnerable to flattery, and Catherine's youth seemed the perfect cure for his wounded ego. To him, she represented a chance to begin anew, to erase the memory of his mortification over Anne's likeness to a Flanders mare, and to rebalance the scales of his reputation. But in lifting Catherine so high, Henry also enfolded her in the most lethal of snares. The Tudor court was a realm of shadows, where loyalty was measured by obedience, and a misstep could swiftly lead to disgrace or worse. Catherine's novelty dazzled the nobility, drawing countless suitors at her door, each eager to curry favour with the king through her. Rival factions competed for her smile, whispered secrets about her wardrobe, and speculated on her next public appearance. Each compliment paid at her elbow was, in effect, a reflection upon Henry. Praised Catherine, praised the king's discernment, slight Catherine, slight his judgment. From the moment she ascended to the throne, Catherine's days were filled with the echo of expectation. At court banquets, her laughter filled the vaulted halls. At mask performances, she danced in silks embroidered with golden thread, every step a testament to her newfound status. Yet the same attention that buoyed her spirits also placed her on the razor's edge of scandal. Every choice she made, her choice of attire, her cultivated friendships, even her carriage when riding through the palace gardens, was subject to scrutiny by those who sought her favour or plotted her downfall. Henry, for his part, enveloped her in an almost desperate tenderness, as though he feared that even a moment's neglect might draw her away, or tarnish the image he so desperately clung to. He called her "my rose without a thorn," a phrase that fluttered through courtly verse, gilding her reputation. But roses, he knew, were fragile. A single prickle could mar their petals forever. And in elevating Catherine to symbol of his invincible majesty, he also dangled her fate before court action. Any whisper of impropriety would echo as a betrayal not merely of affection, but of the very crown he wore. Thus, in the hushed glow of candlelit chambers, as Catherine Howard settled into her gilded apartments, she became both the healing salve and the unwitting trap for Henry's wounded pride. Her arrival at court promised renewal, a chance for the king to reclaim his vigour and his honour. Yet beneath the silken canopies and the sumptuous feasts lay a perilous promise. In saving his reputation, Catherine would be bound by it, her every heartbeat, a note in the symphony of Henry's fragile sovereignty. King Henry VIII pursued Catherine with the ardour of a lovesick youth. He penned letters in a careful, looping script, each line a declaration of devotion. He addressed her as "my sweetest rose," "my dearest delight," and other tender epithets that fluttered against the ear as softly as a sigh. Along with his words, he sent lavish gifts of jewellery, strings of pearls, each pearl nearly the size of a small hazelnut, and a gold necklace set with rubies and sapphires. He whispered pet names in her ear during private audiences, his voice low and urgent, as though these moments of intimacy might vanish at dawn. For Catherine, who had never before known such unreserved affection, Henry's attention must have felt intoxicating. She, a girl who had grown up in the stifling dormitories of Norfolk House, had seldom been the object of genuine, constant admiration. To feel the king's favour was to step into the warm glow of a new world, one in which her worth was measured by love rather than lineage. And so, on the 28th of July, 1540, they were married in a ceremony at Hampton Court Palace that shimmered with both splendour and solemnity. The wedding day itself was a spectacle of Tudor pageantry. Banners emblazoned with the royal arms, tapestries depicting scenes of chivalry, and a procession of courtiers in silken doublets and velvet gowns. Catherine, draped in a gown of white satin embroidered with gold thread, processed down the aisle to join her husband. The royal choir sang psalms of praise, their voices weaving through the vaulted hall like slow currents. When at last Catherine stood beside Henry, her veil lifted to reveal her gentle features, the court murmured in admiration. In that instant, she was no longer the neglected niece in a sprawling household. She was Queen of England, the most powerful woman in the realm, elevated from obscurity to glory in the span of less than 2 years. At 19 years old, Catherine's reign began with a flourish of joy. Henry, still captivated by her vivacity, declared her his "rose without a thorn," a phrase that rippled through the palace and beyond. Courtiers bowed deeply when she passed, curtsying with practiced deference, eager to offer gifts or perform some small service in the hope of winning her favour. In the great banqueting hall, Catherine presided over sumptuous feasts, her laughter mingling with the clink of goblets and the strains of lutes. It was said that her presence could brighten the dreariest of days, and for a time, the court brimmed with an almost childlike happiness. Yet beneath the surface of these celebrations, shadows lingered. The same courtiers who bent the knee to Catherine's beauty and charm chattered behind their hands about her inexperience. They noted, in soft tones, that she was far younger than any of Henry's previous queens, and they wondered whether such youth was a blessing or a liability. There were whispers of envy among older noblewomen, who saw Catherine's meteoric rise as a threat to their own influence. And in the dim corners of the palace, where torchlight barely reached, men in sumptuous attire plotted how best to leverage her favour for their own advantage. Moreover, Catherine's own past indiscretions, her youthful liaisons with Henry Manox and Francis Derham, remained buried only as long as no one dared to exhume them. In a court that prized reputation above almost all else, a single scandal could unravel the most carefully constructed facade. Beneath the veneer of celebration, the machinery of Tudor intrigue rattled. Letters were discreetly copied, whispers were passed along tarnished corridors, and alliances were forged in the flicker of candle flames. The court was at once a stage for public revelry and a cauldron of private machinations. In those early days of her queenship, Catherine must have felt a mixture of elation and apprehension. The burdens of her new position weighed lightly at first. She was adored, feted, and protected by the king's unyielding devotion. Yet each affectionate glance Henry threw her way also served as a reminder of what he stood to lose. His wounded pride, still fresh from the humiliation of his marriage to Anne of Cleves and the execution of Thomas Cromwell, found in Catherine a chance for renewal. But it was a renewal teetering on the edge of a blade. Too much flattery might breed complacency, too little might rekindle the king's insecurities. And so, as Catherine moved through the palace's gilded halls, flanked by her ladies and attended by pages bearing scented gloves and perfumed fans, she remained blissfully unaware of the snares being set around her. The courtiers who smiled at her face might have daggers hidden in their smiles. The notes of music that soothed her spirit also masked the discordant undertones of envy and ambition. In the very act of being raised so high, the centre of Henry's affection and the envy of the realm, Catherine found herself perched atop a precarious throne. The brightest of courts, bathed in candlelight and laughter, concealed the murmurs of treachery that would one day eclipse the joy of her early reign. By 1541, a soft murmur of doubt had reached the ears of Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. In the hush of candlelit corridors at Hampton Court Palace, whispers danced like motes in a shaft of light, tales of Catherine Howard's youthful indiscretions, hints of a secret devotion to Francis Derham, when she was but a girl in her early teens. Cranmer, a man ever mindful of the spiritual and moral well-being of the realm, could not ignore such rumours. He resolved to investigate discreetly, lest scandal erupt and poison both church and court. Under Cranmer's careful direction, inquiries began in the shadows. The Queen's chambermaids, once content to smooth her gowns and braid her hair, found themselves summoned one by one to a private chamber off the gallery. There, in low voices and with trembling hands, they were questioned about every fleeting encounter they might have witnessed. At first, the questions seemed innocuous enough. "Did you ever see Lady Catherine with Master Francis Derham?" But soon they cut deeper, probing for the concealed truths that might lie buried in the Queen's past. The first confession came from a maid named Alice, who trembled as she recalled a whispered conversation by torchlight in the corridors of the Dowager Duchess's house. "He called her his wife," she admitted, voice quavering, though they were not wed in church. Alice's confession hinted at a bond deeper than mere flirtation. In Derham's mind, at least, Catherine had been more than a fleeting fancy. The notion of such a clandestine marriage, however informal, carried grave implications in a realm governed by strict codes of honour and obedience. Encouraged by this revelation, Cranmer's investigators pressed on. Another maid, Bethany by name, spoke of secret rendezvous. "I saw them in the moonlight," she whispered, "at the far end of the gardens, where the yew hedges stand thick." Bethany's vision of Derham and Catherine, her crimson gown brushing against the cool stone path, painted a picture of intimacy that, though devoid of public ceremony, suggested deep familiarity and promise. Such nocturnal encounters, once considered youthful folly, now bore the weight of potential treason, for a queen's private actions were inseparable from the dignity of the crown. But it was the final whisper that delivered the fatal blow. News arrived of Catherine's clandestine meetings with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. Culpeper, a man of high rank and close confidence, had allegedly contrived secret visits to the Queen's apartments, slipping past guards under cover of night. The thought that Catherine might have entertained such a trusted courtier in the King's own domain set alarm bells ringing. Cranmer, whose duty was to uphold both spiritual and temporal order, recognized that these revelations could shatter the very fabric of royal authority. Thus, in the autumn of 1541, Cranmer compiled his evidence. Confessions of informal vows with Francis Derham, testimonies of midnight meetings, and the most damning link of all to Thomas Culpeper. It was a scandal not solely of adulterous liaisons, but of concealed truths and broken trust. Cranmer's findings were presented to the king in a sealed report, a dossier of private affairs laid bare for Henry's judgment. Ironically, Catherine's execution was not decreed for any fresh indiscretion with Culpeper. Rather, it was for the secrets she had carried into her queenship. The charge was one of concealment, hiding her earlier attachments from the sovereign who had taken her as his wife. To Henry VIII, the greatest betrayal was not the flesh, but the lie. A queen who withheld her own history had invited humiliation upon the crown. Cranmer's meticulous documentation of those earlier relationships provided the unassailable proof needed to condemn her, for in a land where reputation was law, the concealment of past sins was tantamount to treason. In the hush that followed these courtly inquiries, Catherine found herself besieged by memories she could neither erase nor explain. The words of her chambermaids, echoes of footsteps in the corridor, torches guttering in the draught, became the instruments of her downfall. Each confession, measured and precise, was a nail in the coffin of her innocence. And while the allegations of adultery would be recited as formal charges, it was the hidden secrets, the youthful intimacies with Derham, and the whispered meetings with Culpeper that sealed her fate. Thus, in the quiet autumn of 1541, Archbishop Cranmer's secret investigation transformed bedroom whispers into the provable evidence of a queen's betrayal. The lessons of that inquiry spoke to a truth far graver than romantic folly. In Tudor England, the mind's concealment could be as damning as the body's betrayal. And as Catherine Howard awaited the king's final verdict, she was left to ponder how the quietest rumours, once unheeded, could become the most inescapable realities. When the truth emerged in November 1541, King Henry VIII's investigators set about constructing their case with methodical precision. In the dimly lit chambers of the royal court, they summoned servants one by one, questioning each in turn about every whispered rumour and clandestine meeting. Their inquiries were exhaustive. They sought the smallest detail, the tiniest scrap of evidence that might bind Catherine Howard to acts of betrayal. First, they interviewed the chamber staff maids who had brushed the Queen's hair, pages who had delivered her letters, and valets who had carried her wardrobe trunks. These witnesses, often young and terrified, recounted the furtive visits of Francis Derham and the clandestine appointments in shadowed corridors. The investigators charted each testimony on parchment scrolls, mapping Derham's footsteps from Norfolk House to the sprawling gardens of Hampton Court, and noting the precise times of night when the Queen's attendants had seen him enter her apartments. Next, the detectives turned their attention to the letters themselves. They seized every scrap of parchment between Derham and Catherine, comparing the inked words and sealed crests. Some letters bore the faint impression of a pressed flower. Others hinted at veiled promises of future devotion. The investigators examined each seal, noting that the Queen's signet ring had once pressed into the soft wax, binding the words with royal authority. By day they laboured in dusty chambers, poring over the cursive loops of Catherine's youthful handwriting. By night they awaited fresh confessions, brought forth under duress. For it was in the torture chambers of the Tower iron-bound cells hidden beneath the castle's stone ramparts that the final admissions were wrung from Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper. Derham was the first to falter. Under the relentless pressure of interrogation, his wrists chafed by iron shackles, his limbs weakened by days without sustenance, he confessed that Catherine had indeed promised to marry him in private. He spoke of whispered oaths beneath the moonlit sky, and vows exchanged in secluded groves. Yet he also implicated his erstwhile beloved by suggesting that her affections had since shifted to Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's privy chamber who had grown too intimate in the Queen's confidence. When Culpeper was brought before the King's judges, he met the accusations with defiance. "I have never lain with the Queen," he declared proudly, his voice echoing in the vaulted court. But as the weight of Henry's fury bore down upon him, and as the promise of a traitor's death loomed, he too capitulated. He admitted to secret encounters held in the hush of night, when torches cast long shadows on stone walls, and to a longing for Catherine's favour so intense it had consumed his reason. He insisted no physical crime had been committed, yet he did not deny that he craved the Queen's affection in ways that threatened the sanctity of the throne. Amid these confessions, Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, and once the sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn, was discovered to have been the facilitator of these meetings. As one of Catherine's closest attendants, she had opened doors and smoothed pathways for Derham and Culpeper alike. The investigations laid bare her role. She had delivered messages, arranged midnight appointments, and accompanied the lovers when discretion was paramount. Whether she believed she was nurturing an innocent friendship or covering up an illicit affair became irrelevant the moment Henry decreed that all involved should suffer the same fate as traitors. Thus, in the chill of November, the wheels of Tudor justice turned inexorably toward a grim conclusion. The king, who valued absolute loyalty above mercy, would brook no compromise. In his view, Catherine's greatest sin lay not in the acts themselves, but in her concealment of them, from a girl's youthful indiscretions blossoming into whispered encounters, to a queen's failure to disclose her past to her husband and sovereign. Each concealed secret was a dagger at the heart of royal honour. By mid-December of 1541, writs had been issued for the arrest and indictment of Francis Derham, Thomas Culpeper, Jane Boleyn, and Catherine Howard herself. Derham was condemned to the traitor's death, hanged, drawn and quartered on the 10th of December, while Culpeper, as a gentleman, would face the less gruesome but no less fatal blade of the axe. Jane Boleyn, for her part in facilitating the Queen's meetings, found herself stripped of titles and privileges, her fate to be determined alongside her Queen. Yet it was Catherine's own destiny that hung most precariously in the balance. Parliament prepared to pass a Bill of Attainder in January 1542, a legislative act that would bypass the need for a formal trial. This bill charged Catherine with concealing her relationships with Manox and Derham from Henry, and with committing adultery after marriage by receiving Culpeper's visits. The evidence, compiled from tortured confessions and intercepted letters, was deemed incontrovertible. In those weeks before the bill's passage, Catherine experienced a solitude far removed from the glittering halls of Hampton Court. Removed of her royal trappings, she was confined in her chamber at the Tower of London, watched day and night by guards sworn to prevent her escape or any further communication. Her royal wardrobe was replaced with a simple gown of brown wool. Her chambermaids were withdrawn. Even her prayers were subject to the scrutiny of court clerks. The Queen, once clothed in silk and gold, now awaited her fate in the cold grey stone, abandoned by the very courtiers who had once bowed at her approach. And so, as the chill of winter settled over the Thames, Henry VIII's methodical investigation built upon interrogation, tortured confessions, and the ruthless application of Tudor law sealed Catherine Howard's doom. It was not passion alone that condemned her, but the web of secrets she had woven around her life, now unravelled by those who would tolerate no falsehood at the foot of the throne. In the quiet hours before dawn, she would have known that the king's justice is resolute, and that once the cloak of deception is cast aside, even a queen must stand naked before the blade. Derham and Culpeper were convicted of treason and executed on the 10th of December, 1541. Francis Derham met the full traitor's death. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body displayed in 4 grisly segments as a warning to any who might challenge royal authority. Thomas Culpeper, by contrast, was granted the mercy accorded to a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. On the same day, he was led to the scaffold at Tower Hill and beheaded with a single stroke of the executioner's axe. As the winter chill settled over London, attention turned to Catherine Howard herself. In January 1542, Parliament passed the Bill of Attainder against the former Queen. This legislative act bypassed the need for a formal trial, condemning her on paper alone. The charges were precise. She had concealed her past relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Derham from King Henry VIII, and she had committed adultery with Thomas Culpeper after her marriage. By Tudor law, such offences against the sovereign and the sanctity of marriage amounted to treason, meriting the gravest of penalties. Yet the evidence of post-marital adultery was remarkably thin. There was no eyewitness account of Catherine and Culpeper in an explicit embrace, nor any physical proof that the Queen and her gentleman had lain together. The surviving letters between them speak of longing and fear, of clandestine meetings and furtive glances, but they fall short of confirming a consummated affair. Historians remain uncertain whether Catherine and Culpeper ever crossed the final boundary of physical intimacy. Some suggest that their relationship, though passionate, may have remained chaste, or at least ambiguous enough that definitive proof eluded the investigators. Catherine's own correspondence, though candid in its expressions of affection, also reveals an undercurrent of anxiety. In one letter she wrote of her trembling heart, confessing that she feared discovery even as she yearned for Culpeper's presence. In another, she begged for patience and discretion, urging her confidant to spare her honour in the king's eyes. These fragments paint a picture of a young woman caught between desire and dread, seeking solace in a friend while dreading the consequences of exposure. When Catherine was first led from Hampton Court Palace to her confinement in the Tower, she was stripped of her royal trappings. Her sumptuous gowns were replaced by a plain kirtle of woolen grey. Her golden coiffure was covered by a coif of simple linen. She was left in what contemporaries called the gilded prison of the Tower, a suite of chambers once reserved for distinguished prisoners, now her reluctant quarters. Guards patrolled her corridor, intercepting her letters, and the keys to her chamber were held by the king's most trusted servants. For Catherine, the charge that held the greatest import was not adultery itself, but the concealment of her earlier attachments. In Henry VIII's eyes, the gravest betrayal lay in having lied to him. The Queen's failure to disclose her past to the sovereign she had vowed to serve was, in his mind, a rupture of the sacred bond between husband and wife, and, by extension, between subject and monarch. To be a queen was to be the embodiment of honesty and virtue, a living symbol of the realm's moral order. By hiding her liaisons, Catherine had undermined the very essence of her station. Thus, though Parliament's bill cited both concealment and adultery, Henry made clear through his actions and private counsel that he cared little for the technicality of infidelity. He cared most that Catherine had deceived him. In his correspondence with Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley, he wrote that a queen who could so lightly mask her past could never be trusted with the present. His words, recorded on parchment in meticulous script, reveal a monarch whose wounded pride demanded recompense beyond mere legalism. And so, in the stark days following the bill's passage, Catherine Howard's fate was sealed. There would be no reconsideration, no room for mercy. The full force of Tudor justice bore down upon her, not because she had slept with a courtier, but because she had misled her husband, the King of England, the supreme arbiter of law and honour. To Henry, deceit within marriage was an affront graver even than physical betrayal. He believed that truth was the foundation upon which sovereignty rested, and a queen's lie was a crack in the very bedrock of his authority. In the cold dawn of February 13th, 1542, Catherine would walk to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died. She would offer prayers for the king and the realm, then kneel before the block, her final moments consumed by the echo of iron and stone. But on that scaffold, the question of whether she had truly committed adultery would remain as elusive as the wind through the tower's battlements. What mattered to Henry VIII and to the annals of Tudor history was her single, irrefutable transgression, that she had spoken falsehood to her king. And in his law, that falseness warranted the ultimate penalty, for a lie at the heart of power could not be forgiven. When King Henry VIII learned of Catherine Howard's concealed past, his wrath transcended mere betrayal and cut deep to the heart of his pride. He was not merely a monarch wronged, he was a sovereign humiliated. Here was Henry, once the most celebrated prince in Europe, brought low by the whispered misdeeds of a teenage queen. The realization that he had been deceived by someone barely 19, and that in public view he had looked the fool, stung him more fiercely than any physical affront could. Henry VIII, whose very name was synonymous with power and grandeur, could not abide the notion that he had been outwitted by a child. On the 12th of February, 1542, Catherine was told that at dawn the following day she would meet her end. Summoned to a hushed chamber beneath the ancient stones of the tower, she received the grim decree in the presence of the lieutenant of the tower and the king's own heralds. The words were formal yet merciless. She would be executed on Tower Green the next morning. For Catherine, once clothed in velvet and jewels, the announcement marked the final unravelling of her gilded existence. That night, the young queen spent her hours in the dim solitude of her chamber, now stripped of every luxury save a single tallow candle. The hush was broken only by the quiet tread of guards and the distant tolling of the chapel bell. Yet what she did next was almost unimaginable in its poignancy. Catherine practised with the executioner's block. With solemn calm, she knelt before the rough-hewn block of oak, placing her forehead against its chilled surface. She tested her posture, adjusting the alignment of her shoulders, tilting her chin just so, all in preparation for the one precise moment when the executioner's axe would fall. Imagine that scene. A 19-year-old girl alone in a stone cell, tracing the contours of her own death. The dull glow of the candle cast her shadow against the cold walls, elongating her fragile form in a silent dance macabre. Each placement of her head on the block was both an acceptance of fate and an act of survival, as though mastering the mechanics of death might grant her some small measure of control. The rough grain of the oak, smoothed only in the area worn by countless heads, was her sole guide. In those relentless minutes, Catherine faced the reality of her own mortality with a courage that transcended her youth. All through the dark hours, the Queen's thoughts must have drifted between hope and dread. Perhaps she prayed for mercy, confessing her sins to God in words too faint to reach the ears of any watchful sentinel. Perhaps she rehearsed the words she would speak to the gathered crowd, his subjects who might see compassion in her final plea. Yet as the candle guttered and the air grew chill, she knew there would be no reprieve. Henry's fury, stoked by wounded pride and wounded honour, would brook no delay. At last, the hour neared. Catherine surrendered her little coif and the plain gown she had worn for weeks to the waiting guards. She descended the narrow spiral stair from her chamber to the courtyard, each step echoing like a heartbeat. The heavy oak door swung open onto the cold, pre-dawn air of Tower Green. Here, on this very spot where 6 years earlier her cousin Anne Boleyn had knelt in crimson velvet, Catherine took her place. It was the 13th of February, 1542. As dawn broke, a pale light washed over the courtyard, illuminating the assembled soldiers, heralds, and a sparse crowd of onlookers. The block stood at the centre, its surface already damp with dew. Catherine, her cheeks flushed with both cold and fear, approached the spot with measured steps. The executioner, dressed in a dark doublet and hose, waited behind the block, his axe resting on his shoulder like a solemn pendulum. In those final moments, Catherine's unwavering silence echoed louder than any plea for mercy. She knelt gracefully, the hem of her grey woolen kirtle brushing the dew-laden grass. A priest stood at her side, offering a small crucifix and murmuring prayers for her soul. Catherine grasped the crucifix to her breast, closed her eyes, and whispered a final Ave Maria. The executioner placed her head upon the block. Catherine took a steadying breath, and with one precise motion, the steel blade descended. The thud of steel on wood was the last sound Catherine Howard would ever heed. In that instant, the Tower of London bore witness to the echo of a doomed young life, her final act of dignity carved into the history of stone and memory. Thus ended the story of a queen whose concealment of youthful secrets had provoked a king's ire and shattered both her crown and her life. In the quiet aftermath, only the whisper of the wind through the battlements remained, carrying with it the echo of her silent sacrifice. Catherine Howard addressed the small gathering with a voice both calm and measured. In the grey dawn of February 13th, 1542, she offered a brief prayer for the king and for the realm, beseeching blessings upon Henry VIII and his subjects. "May God preserve the sovereign of this land," she intoned, her voice carrying softly across the hushed courtyard. A prayer for her own forgiveness was the final gift she gave to those who watched in solemn silence. Then, with dignity unbroken by fear, Catherine knelt before the executioner's block. Her grey woolen kirtle pooled around her as she bowed her head, aligning her forehead with the smooth, worn timber. The executioner stepped forward, lifted his axe, its blade shining coldly in the morning light, and brought it down in a single, practiced stroke. In that instant, Catherine Howard's brief life came to an end. But her story did not conclude with that final breath. What happened next to her body would become one of history's most baffling mysteries. Under the strict protocols of Tudor justice, executed traitors at the Tower of London were customarily laid to rest within the castle's own sacred confines. The venue for these burials was the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, a small parish church nestled against the inner wall of the tower. Over centuries, it had become the de facto cemetery for those who perished by the executioner's axe. Regardless of rank, if they met their death on Tower Green, their mortal remains were interred here. Indeed, the chapel's soil already held the fractured remains of Anne Boleyn, Catherine's ill-fated cousin, beheaded on May 19th, 1536. Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, who suffered that same tragic fate on March 30th, 1542, just weeks before Catherine lay alongside Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, executed on May 28th, 1538. Records compiled by the chroniclers of the Grey Friars of London confirm that Catherine herself was buried within the tower walls, her grave to lie beside these other royal victims for centuries to come. Contemporary guides to the tower pointed out Catherine's supposed resting place, a location just to the right of the high altar, marked by a modest inscription. Tourists were directed to pause before a worn slab of stone, the name Catherine Howard, Queen, faintly legible in the carving below a Tudor rose. Local lore and guidebooks wove her memory into the fabric of the tower's ancient walls, suggesting a continuity of sorrow that spanned generations of tragic royal women. For 3 centuries, visitors to the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula would step carefully over shallow grave mounds, mindful that beneath their feet lay fragments of Tudor history. They would whisper of Catherine's last words, imagine her final prayer, and reflect on how swiftly the glitter of pageantry could turn to dust. Her name appeared on parish records. Her epitaph was cited in guidebooks. Her grave became part of the tower's lore, a quiet testament to her brief, turbulent reign. Yet, in 1876, a routine restoration project upended this well-established narrative. Surveyors and workers, led by the engineer Doyne Courtney Bell, lifted the chapel's uneven flagstones to level the floor and address health concerns. They intended merely to refurbish a crumbling floor, but their digging revealed the skeletal remains of Anne Boleyn, identified by her height and the placement of her burial niche. Nearby lay the bones of Margaret Pole and Jane Boleyn, each skeleton roughly aligned with historical expectations. But when the excavation reached the spot designated for Catherine, her appointed resting place beside the altar, the workers found nothing. No shards of bone, no fragment of tooth, not even the faintest trace of dust that might have clung to her grave. Across the chapel floorboards, the expected yawning void of Catherine Howard's remains was as stark as a blank page in history. Victorian records note the astonishment of Doyne Courtney Bell and his team. No remains which could be identified as those of Queen Catherine Howard were found. The report stated with deliberate understatement. Tour guides, once so certain of her gravesite, were left to explain the absence. The stone slab that bore her name remained in place, but beneath, no body lay waiting. The site of her grave, marked for centuries, had become an empty monument to a vanished queen. Thus, Catherine's burial rites, so meticulously observed for her predecessors, collapsed into silence and mystery. The chapel, once thought to hold her bones, now offered only the inscrutable hush of the unknown. Tourists would continue to kneel before her marker, to ponder her final prayer, and the cruelty of absolute power. Yet the truth of her resting place eluded all who sought it. Her grave had been recorded, her name memorialized, but beneath the stone, Catherine Howard's remains had slipped beyond the reach of history, leaving behind one of the Tudor era's most enduring enigmas. By 1876, the Tower of London was quietly humming with the sounds of renovation. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, long burdened by centuries of shallow burials and shifting soil, needed its uneven flooring reset. The project was entrusted to Doyne Courtney Bell, an engineer tasked with both restoring the chapel's structural integrity and preserving its storied past. Bell pored over ancient records, parish registers and burial books dating back to the reign of Henry VIII, carefully mapping where each notable interment was thought to lie beneath the flagstones. According to these documents, Anne Boleyn's grave should rest just before the high altar. Catherine Howard's resting place, the records stated, lay a little to the right, alongside Jane Boleyn's. These precise descriptions set the stage for what many hoped would be a definitive confirmation of Tudor history. When work began, Bell's team lifted the worn paving stones in systematic order, photographing each stage and noting the position of skeletal remains as they emerged. In the first trench, they uncovered the remains of a woman whose height and pelvic structure matched contemporary descriptions of Anne Boleyn, beheaded on May 19, 1536. The skeleton lay in good condition given its age, though some bones had been disturbed over time. Close by, the team found the tall, robust skeleton of a man his stature and build consistent with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, executed for treason in August 1553. These discoveries lent confidence that the project's historical coordinates were sound. Continuing their excavation, Bell's workers identified two additional female skeletons. The first, smaller and more delicate, exhibited signs of middle age. The positioning of the grave and the remains' proximity to known Boleyn interments suggested Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, who met her end by execution on March 30th, 1542. The second skeleton bore traces of arthritis in the hands and spine, consistent with a woman in her 60s, likely Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, beheaded May 28, 1538. Each set of remains was carefully documented, reinterred in wooden coffins lined with straw, and labelled for reburial once the floor was relaid. But when the dig reached the spot marked for Catherine Howard, her supposed grave a few paces to the right of the altar, no remains greeted their calls. The shovels turned earth and cobblestone alike, revealing only compacted soil and fragments of medieval mortar. There was no bone, no skull fragment, not even the faint residue of dust that would indicate a long-buried body. Bell's meticulous notes recorded the eerie emptiness. Where the other graves had yielded tangible proof of Tudor tragedy, Catherine's place lay ghostly and bare. Perplexed, the Victorian team paused to review their records. Could Catherine's youthful bones, laid to rest in 1542, have decomposed completely? Historical belief then held that lime used in Tudor burials might accelerate decay. Bell himself noted the theory in his journals. Yet the preservation of the other skeletons argued against total dissolution. Had her remains been scattered among neighbouring graves by later burials? Or had someone, at some unrecorded moment, surreptitiously moved her bones elsewhere? Such speculations, however, remained unconfirmable. In the end, Bell's report contained a single haunting sentence that would echo through the annals of Tower lore. No remains which could be identified as those of Queen Catherine Howard were found. This understated declaration appeared in the official minutes of the restoration project and was later cited by guidebooks and pamphlets. Tourists visiting the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula continued to kneel before the stone slab bearing Catherine's name, reciting her final prayer and pondering the cruel irony that she had vanished even in death. Thus, what began as a routine refurbishment transformed into one of history's strangest mysteries. The graves of Anne Boleyn, Jane Boleyn, Margaret Pole, and John Dudley lay beneath the chapel floor, their bones whispering of power and downfall. But Catherine Howard's remains remained elusive. Her grave, an empty space marked by silent devotion. Nearly 3 centuries of certainty gave way to doubt, and the empty plot beside the altar became a monument not only to her life and death, but to the enduring question: where and how does one find a queen who refuses to be found? The disappearance of Catherine Howard's remains has inspired a host of theories, each seeking to explain why her grave stands empty amid the bones of her fellow royals. 1. The lime decomposition theory, now discredited. In 1876, Doyne Courtney Bell suggested that the lime used by Tudor embalmers to hasten decomposition had effectively dissolved Catherine's youthful bones. After all, she was only 19 when she died, and her bones might have been thought to be more cartilaginous and fragile than those of older interments. Yet modern forensic science has conclusively demonstrated that lime actually promotes preservation. By drawing moisture away and creating an alkaline environment, it stabilizes collagen and protects skeletal material against microbial decay. The very same lime that likely aided in the remarkable survival of Anne Boleyn's skeleton would have preserved Catherine's rather than destroyed it. 2. The natural decay theory. Some have proposed that Catherine's bones, being from a teenage skeleton, were intrinsically thinner and more prone to fragmentation over the centuries. Natural processes, soil acidity, water infiltration, root activity, could gradually break down delicate bones until they vanished entirely. However, this logic falters when confronted with the condition of graves beside hers. Anne Boleyn's bones, though disturbed by prior renovations, remained largely intact, and Jane Boleyn's skeleton exhibited surprisingly robust preservation. If environmental factors alone were at play, one would expect uniform degradation across all graves in the chapel. 3. The commingled remains theory. Over 3 centuries, the cramped space of St. Peter ad Vincula could have led to interment overlaps and inadvertent mixing. As new chambers were carved and existing graves shifted, Catherine's bones might have become scattered among neighbouring burials. Such commingling could render her remains indistinguishable from those of other victims, effectively hiding them within a mass of disarticulated fragments. Yet Bell's Victorian team reported clear grave groupings, distinct clusters of skeletal material that aligned with individual burial locations, making total commingling less plausible. 4. The alternative burial site theory. Contemporary chronicles state only that Catherine was buried within the tower, without explicitly naming the chapel. It is conceivable that her grave lay outside St. Peter ad Vincula, perhaps in another consecrated plot within the tower precincts, or even in a temporary pit, later covered by successive burials. A relocation could reflect ad hoc decisions by officials seeking to expedite burial during a particularly busy period of executions. Nonetheless, no surviving record identifies another burial site for a queen, and the tradition of interment at St. Peter ad Vincula was well established by 1542. 5. The oversight or omission theory. Despite Bell's careful mapping, it remains possible that his excavation team simply missed Catherine's grave. Perhaps her burial lay just beyond the edges of their trenches, or deeper than the expected depth of 6 to 8 inches. The Victorians expanded their dig in measured sections, but limitations of time, resources, or structural concerns might have constrained the full extent of their search. An unexamined niche or a deeper shaft could still conceal her bones, waiting for a more exhaustive exploration that, given the chapel's status as a working church, will almost certainly never occur. 6. The grave robbing theory. The practice of exhuming the remains of famous individuals for relic collection or medical study persisted into the 18th century. Catherine Howard's status as a tragic queen could have made her remains a sought-after curiosity. Grave robbers, ranging from medical students to souvenir hunters, may have pilfered her skeleton or selected bones, leaving behind an unfinished raid that removed only her most identifiable remains. Such thefts rarely targeted entire skeletons, but for someone of Catherine's notoriety, an organized effort might have succeeded in extracting the bulk of her bones for clandestine sale or display. 7. The intentional removal theory, most compelling. The most alluring hypothesis posits that at some point between 1542 and 1876, Catherine's remains were deliberately moved. Why? Perhaps to clear space for later burials in an already crowded chapel, or out of a long-forgotten sense that she merited a more conspicuous or reverent resting place. Yet if her skeleton were exhumed and reinterred elsewhere, perhaps in a private chapel or family vault, there should exist archival evidence, church registers, household accounts, or ecclesiastical permissions. No such documents have surfaced. The silence in the records only deepens the mystery, suggesting either an informal removal by those with the means and motive to act without scrutiny, or a tragic loss of paperwork over the ensuing centuries. Each theory, from decomposition to deception, seeks to fill the void left by Catherine Howard's missing remains. While modern science can dismiss the lime decay argument and cast doubt on simple natural processes, no single explanation fully accounts for why her grave yielded nothing. Whether lost to time, scattered by human hands, or forever hidden beyond the compass of Victorian trowels, Catherine's final secret endures. Beneath the flagstones of St. Peter ad Vincula, or perhaps somewhere entirely unknown, her bones remain, refusing to be found, as if safeguarding the last whisper of a queen who was silenced too soon. More than 400 years have passed since Catherine Howard drew her final breath on Tower Green, yet her story continues to captivate us. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened to her body, but why we remain so eager to find it. In Catherine, we recognize vulnerability incarnate, a young woman groomed, maneuvered, and ultimately sacrificed by men who claimed to love her. She was born into a world where alliances were brokered in whispers, where the agency of women was all but invisible, and where the worth of a body was measured in political advantage. Her charges, though legally sound under Tudor statutes, rest on an ethical foundation that seems unsteady, revealing a justice bent less on truth than on the preservation of male egos. Catherine's death served the psychological needs of Henry VIII, more than it did any true notion of justice. By executing her, he punished a reflection of his wounded pride, a reminder that he had been deceived by a girl not yet 20. In that act of public vengeance, Henry reaffirmed his dominion and stilled the mocking whispers that had followed his ill-fated marriage to Anne of Cleves. Catherine became a symbol, a scapegoat for male humiliation. And as she knelt before the executioner's block, the world watched, not to learn compassion, but to witness the power of a king who brooked no challenge to his authority. Yet beyond the political spectacle lies a deeper, more troubling truth. Catherine Howard was a voiceless participant in her own tragedy. Groomed at 13 by her music master, manipulated by a secret suitor, and plucked from obscurity only to become entangled in court intrigues, she never had full control over her narrative. Her attempts to keep certain events hidden were not acts of defiance, but of self-preservation, in a realm where secrecy was the only currency of survival. To reveal too much was to invite ruin. To stay silent was to risk the wrath of the throne. Thus, the vanishing of her bones is a powerful metaphor for the absence of her voice in historical records. Archaeologists may uncover her family's tombs, or the remains of other Tudor notables with methodical care, but Catherine's resting place remains deliberately elusive. Her disappearance under the chapel floorboards mirrors the erasure of her perspective. We know what her accusers said, what her sovereign demanded, what the executioner recorded, but Catherine's own words, her own account of fear, regret, or sorrow, were lost amid the rush of court gossip and the clang of steel. In seeking her missing remains, we chase more than bone, we chase her story. We long to restore to history the voice that was stifled by protocol and power. Each fragment of parchment, each whispered theory, feels like a breadcrumb leading us back to a girl whose real experiences were overshadowed by her title. When we stand before the empty grave marker in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, we are reminded of the countless lives whose realities lie buried under layers of politics and prejudice. Perhaps Catherine, in her final act, secured the last word by ensuring she could never be fully reclaimed by history. By refusing to stay in the ground, she beckons us to keep searching, to keep questioning, to refuse closure on a life that was all too brief. We wonder whether she ever found peace in that silent darkness beneath the tower stones. We wonder whether her spirit lingers in the shadows where so many secrets dwell. Some find comfort in the thought that her bones rest somewhere undiscovered, waiting like a locked diary, ready to speak if ever coaxed into the light. Others accept that her story is meant to remain incomplete, a testament to the countless voices silenced by power. In either case, Catherine Howard's final secret endures beneath the flagstones of the Tower of London. The truth of what truly happened to her in life and in death remains interred with her bones, unreachable yet always urging us onward. Ultimately, it may be that her true legacy is not what we know, but our ceaseless desire to know more.